Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for another project today. Now instead of a costume or a mid-century sewing project, I kind of have a combo of the two today. I'm going to be making another dressing gown, housecoat, little robe to wear around the house because we don't get to leave the house anymore. You know, the more glamorous things to wear around the house, the better, honestly. So this year's housecoat, you know, every year of the Panini, maybe we'll make a new housecoat. It could be fun. But this year's housecoat is going to be inspired by all the things I was seeing working on the Mandragora gown. So I kept seeing this coat from Crimson Peak, and I thought, you know, that would make a nice housecoat. So I decided I needed a big, puffy-sleeved, 1890s inspired housecoat just to haunt the house. And while I've had this project fizzling away in the back of my mind for a little while now, I was actually asked to join a group of sewers who were going to be working on loungewear and kind of vintage-inspired projects, loungewear projects here in the spring, and so I was asked to join in, and I figured that was just the motivation I needed to actually make this housecoat. So I won't be using my truly Victorian patterns to make this today. I'm just going to be drafting it off the basic block. This is going to be made to be worn over like pajamas, not corsetry or anything like that. So I'll show you what I have in mind over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. All right, here we are. I have a tracing, of course, of my front bodice block pattern here, so we can make this princess-themed 1890s inspired housecoat. So first things first, I need to separate this off into having a yoke. So we have this curved yoke up here. I was trying to determine how deep I wanted that to be. I think I probably could have made this come down a little bit further. I was just kind of basing it off of the inspiration images from Crimson Peak, that coat, where it's got this deep yoke all the way around the collar, or I guess the top half of the garment, on both the front and back. And then I'm going to be closing these darts into a princess seam, so I'm going to open that up into the collar up here. So I'm just drawing a line from the apex up into where that yoke is. I'm going to make this overlap about an inch in the front here. So I'm adding 1.5 inches to my center front here so that I can have 1 inch overlap and then 1/2 inch for seam allowance there. Then I will go ahead and cut this out. All right, so I can go ahead and cut my yoke apart from the rest of the garment here, like so. And I'm going to sew these back together. So of course, as usual, as I always say, I'm going to need to add seam allowance. Anytime I cut the pattern apart and plan to sew it back together, I will need seam allowance. So let me go ahead and add that on before I forget with my handy dandy Sharpie here. Just tape this down so it doesn't floop around on me, and use the same bit of extra paper here just to put seam allowance on the main body here too. I of course will be cutting this apart in a little bit, but I still, again, don't want to forget my seam allowance when I do so. I'm forgetting to trim the front of this main body piece, and I'm wondering if I ever remember to do so. But nothing went wrong, so I'm wondering how the heck it all worked out. Anyhow, I'm about to separate this into princess seams, like a front and a side front, by separating this through the darts here. So separating this front piece off, not much changes there, but this side piece, I'm just going to close up the darts, or close up the side dart and cut away the other one. And then, like magic, we have a princess seam down the center front. It's not wildly difficult, it's just hard to refine this. If I were making something other than a housecoat for around the house, I would want to perfect this a little bit better, but because I'm going to be wearing this over other clothes, I'm just trying to create a basic shape. It doesn't have to be perfectly, I guess, sculpted over my bust or anything like that. So I'm just rounding this off. You do add about a 1/16 of an inch above the bust, I think, when you do this. That's the official recommendation. I've shown how to do princess seam here on the channel a little bit before, and again, I will be creating a whole video about it later, a couple months from now, just because editorial schedule, all that jazz. But it's smooth this off over the bust because of course it's quite pointy right now. And of course, because again, this is going to be sewn back to the other piece, I had to add seam allowance on there, and I will need to add seam allowance on this other side as well. So this can be sewn like this, and again, the cone of the bust, as usual, is still created. You can see where those darts went. There's a dart up into the shoulder, and there's a dart into the waist still. It's just a seam line now instead of darts proper. It is now a style line, a princess seam line. And let me add on my seam allowance again before I forget. Like so. Will I ever remember to trim the center front? I am so perplexed by this. I'm looking forward to finding out, honestly, as I sit here recording this in hindsight. Alright, you've added seam allowance. I'm proud of you. Trim the front. Nope, she's not going to do it. What the heck? How are you not noticing while you're labeling right now? What are you up to, kid? Alright, well, I'm going to lower the armhole on this side front piece, just so that these arms are not in any way tight, because again, I'm going to be wearing this over t-shirts and just around the house to be comfy. So I want this to be quite comfortable. I'm also going to gradate from like add a 1/4 of an inch up there at the armhole and then grade that down to another 1/2 inch being added at this waist. And I will do the same to the back. So I will have to do the same modifications to the side back. So I have that lowered armhole and that extra width at the waist. I'm never going to notice that, huh? Oh man, I am sad about it. Okay, here we are with the back. I have a tracing of the back, the bodice, basic bodice block back here. So I can do similar sorts of modifications to this, including drawing our yoke on here. So let's go ahead and kind of use this as semi of a guide. This is kind of where it was in the front. It's a round yoke up into the shoulder, like so. Like that. Not too tall. I end up splitting this difference, which is funny. I'm just sketching on here, making decisions, making design decisions on the fly. I think something in the utility room just turned off. How nice. Weird background noises. Anyway, from the, it's not called the apex on the back, but like the high point of the curve of the back, I'm going to draw a line up into that yoke, so I can do the same sort of thing, eliminate this back dart by creating a back princess seam. Again, I'm going to lower my armhole that 1.5 inches, and then come out a 1/2 inch at the waist and a 1/4 inch up at that armhole to add on a little bit of width at the waist for this. And I will cut all of this out. I am cutting this out on the exact center back, so I'm cutting off my seam allowance back here because I do not need to add a zipper or anything to the back of this garment. I don't need to have a center back seam. So I'm just cutting this out with the center back on the center back because I will eventually be cutting that in the fold. Once again, I can cut my yoke apart from the rest of the main body of the garment, and again, add seam allowance to both the yoke and the garment itself. Like so. Tell you what, I wore makeup today. I've already taken it off because it was hurting, and now my eyes are just aching slightly. I put eye drops in, I took my makeup off, and yet my eyes still hurt. They'll hurt for a good day now. That's what I get for wearing makeup today. There was a time when my eyes wouldn't hurt from wearing makeup, and that time is just over. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and cut up through this line to separate the back into the princess seam line as well. Again, I can just eliminate that dart, like so. And I will again need to add seam allowance along the princess seam so that this can be sewn back together later on. Now I will be eliminating the waist seam on this garment as well. So you see me here eliminating all the darts on the front and back, but I will also be taking these main bodice pieces, I guess, and continuing them on and making them into A-line skirt pieces as well. We will get to that later after I do the sleeve. But I'm just refining that seam allowance first here. Alright, so here are 3 pieces for the back. Again, those 2 center back pieces will be cut on the fold, and they will be sewn to the fronts like so. So this is what our main body of the whole dressing gown looks like at this current moment. Again, you could do this to a dress pattern. If you were doing a princess seam like this, though, please do make a mock-up because it is harder to refine that princess seam because you can fit it closer to the body than you can with darts. If you imagine like underneath the bust, you can get a much closer fit if you would like to with a princess seam as opposed to with darts. So do make a mock-up if transitioning into a princess seam because you will want to refine the fit on that. And here I'm just referencing my favorite pattern drafting book from college, referencing how to do a leg of mutton sleeve, as they are called, which is such a gross name for a thing. But it's just a giant puff sleeve. They are originated from the 1890s giant sleeves, which probably originated from those 1840s giant sleeves, honestly. There's been a lot of giant sleeves through history, but the one here in this book is kind of a hangover from the 1980s. But this is how to take your standard sleeve pattern here, which I've shown how to make on the channel, and how to transform it into a leg of mutton sleeve, basically making a giant puff sleeve at the top. So I'm coming down 4 inches and then 3 inches on the side from either side seam, and then connecting those up to that 4-inch mark on the center. So let me go ahead and add one more line in here just to be able to expand this pattern even more, just using the same principle that the book was going over, adding in the same sort of fullness. And again, I want to straighten off these sides, and I do want to lengthen this sleeve a little bit. I want to make this extra long so that I can fold back the cuffs. Like I don't want to sew a separate cuff on, I just want to be able to fold the sleeve back, and because it will be lined in a different color, it'll look like a contrasting cuff. But it's just because I made the sleeve really long. That's the secret to doing cuffs on a straight sleeve. Just make them really long and then fold it back. You know? Like so. Alright, so that's nice and long now. It's probably, honestly, 2 inches too long in hindsight, but that's okay. Better to have extra fold back than not enough. Let's go ahead and cut this out. So I can start splitting the top apart and expanding this so we can create a lot of puff up here in the sleeve cap. It's going to be quite giant. Not as giant as the Mandragora gown, but nearing that area. Alright, so I'm going to cut down these lines like so we can split apart. I know these look like darts, but they're not here for fit, they're just here for floof. So they're not darts, they're just wedges of fullness, as I like to say. Cutting down so that nearly through the sides so that we can hinge this open as far as we want. You can hinge this very far open for a puffier sleeve, or only add a little bit of puff in here if you want. It is up to you. Once again, it is a design decision, and if you are concerned about it, you can again mock up your sleeve and see if you've added enough. Go back and do it again until you're happy with the amount of puff going on. Now this does get covered by that kind of flounce ruffle thing that comes down from the yoke on this particular design. You'll see what I mean later. So a lot of this top of the sleeve unfortunately doesn't get seen once I put that curved like round ruffle on this, which I nearly forgot to draft. I did forget to draft the collar on this until I was like cutting out the rest of the fabric, and I was like, oh, I never even drafted a collar for this, so I have to jump in later and draft a standing collar for this. But here I'm just thinking, wait, how do I separate this out? It wants me to separate this out so that the top here is 2 inches apart, but I'm like, that's not enough, surely. So I'm just going to wing it and spread this out even more, because this is the 1890s inspired housecoat, which means we can go as big in the sleeve as we want, you know? Gotta have giant sleeves. Oh, I should not also mention at this point that for this project I bought 7 yards of each color of the flannel. So I bought 14 yards of fabric total for this project, which is a ton. Luckily, cotton flannel is pretty inexpensive. You can get it on sale for like sometimes $3 or $4 a yard. Really cheap. I think mine was still around $4 or $5 a yard, which is still an expensive project. But hopefully, because again, this is something that to wear around the house, and we all spend a lot more time at our house these days, it is something that will get a lot of wear, and so it's therefore a good investment. But yeah, it is a lot of fabric for something like this. You could of course make something like this that is only knee length, however. I'm going to be making mine full length, with a little bit of a train in the back almost. So you could make one much shorter and it would be more practical, and you would get caught on things less, I suppose, as well. But here is my giant sleeve. You can see it's just like separated out. So you pull the sleeve cap apart and add in all this width up here at the top. And the sleeve cap comes up higher than it was originally. So there's height added and a ton of width added. And that's how we make this giant leg of mutton sleeve. I'll maybe do like a detail of different types of sleeves sometime. I definitely want to make a video all about different types of puff sleeves. So we'll get into that. And technically a leg of mutton sleeve is kind of a puff sleeve. It's just a long, gigantic one. All this is going to be gathered down. I was just checking at this point. I was like, is this nearly identical front and back at this point? Yes, just about. Means I won't have to worry if it gets mixed up later. It's mostly just a giant puff, you know? Giant puff-topped tube. But I was thinking, alright, because I lowered that armhole in the bodice so much, obviously there's plenty of width in this that it would probably be fine, but I decided to go ahead and add that 5/8 of an inch at the sides, and taper that into the arm on either side here, just because I had lowered that armhole so much on the bodice pattern that I didn't want all of that to be eating into the puff amount here. I wanted to keep the puff as puff. That's right. So I'm going to cut out 4 of this sleeve total, 2 of the lining and 2 of the exterior fabric, which is the same fabric, just a different color. And so here I'm thinking, all right, I need to take these bodice pieces and attach them to A-line skirt pieces in order to make them full length, basically, and to eliminate the waist seam. So I have a A-line skirt front and back here. This is my A-line skirt pattern, the same one that you've seen me draft here on the pattern before, on the channel before, sorry. And it's just lengthened, so this is made 45 inches long. The skirt is just lengthened from the other length. The angles are all the same. It's just extended in length from the original hemline. I'm just going to split this A-line skirt front in 2, like that. Of course, I'll need to add seam allowance all along this large seam that we're about to have down this skirt. But I'm just going to tape on the top, or like the bodice patterns at the waist to these long skirt patterns and kind of fill in the gaps. So again, I'm not being hyper precise about this because it's a dressing gown. It's not my wedding gown. It'll be fine. So you can see here how this blends in to the, I just like lined it up with the waist princess seam there, and then I will tape all the way down here like so. Again, I need to add that 1.5 inch overlap here. This has a little bit of seam allowance next to the seam, center front. The skirt pattern that I'm using for this already has about 5/8 of an inch, but I'll just add on the other bit of overlap that I have at the top pattern piece here. Although the fact that it doesn't match the yoke perfectly and yet still worked is very confusing to me. But alas, just adding on that front overlap, I'll cut that out. And then I can add on seam allowance along the other side to match up with the seam allowance that is up on the top princess seam here. Because we can see here, I still need seam allowance along this new seam because I cut the pattern apart, and therefore when it gets sewn back together, I will need seam allowance. So I'm just taking all of my scrap, weird little pieces that I keep in a box here next to my table. Actually, I keep a box of scrap paper just so I can use them for things like this. And try and recycle as much as possible and not waste paper, I suppose. But I will again match this up. Up here where that seam allowance meets at the waist, I just round it off a little bit so it's not a perfect like point, but nothing, again, precise or particular. I'm actually going to shorten this by 2 inches too because 45 is like a skirt, a full-length skirt while I'm wearing heels, and I don't intend to wear heels around the house, funny enough. Sadly, because I have a lot of very cute high-heeled shoes, and they're not getting a lot of wear right now because I'm not allowed to leave the house, but one day I will go to dinner again, and the heels will get worn. Until then, I need to do the same sort of steps here for the side front. Once again, this is going to get kind of melded here at the waist. I'm just like splitting the difference here. It's adding a tiny, tiny bit, like a strange little half moon of space in here. Again, I'm just going to round off the waist. This adds a little bit at the waist, but again, I don't mind if my dressing gown is a little loose. That's a good thing to me. I don't need it to be super fitted. I want it to be comfy and cozy. This is something I actually want to wear, although you'll see it's quite an epic thing. Like if you were to answer the door for like the Girl Scouts or somebody in this outfit, they would think that you are possibly some sort of a vampire or Victorian detective, which is not a bad thing, as we know. Again, I'll shorten this 2 inches, and again, I need to add seam allowance down this seam that's going down the center, well, not the center front, the side front, basically. I don't need to add seam allowance on the other side because it's already inherent in my patterns. All my block patterns already have seam allowance on the outside edges. They just need to have seam allowance if I cut into them. So sometimes I get that question. Yes, all my block patterns already have seam allowance built into them. So this A-line skirt pattern already has seam allowance on the side. I don't need to add any there, but I just need to add it down this center split that we've added. So the bodice was separated into princess seams, and now the skirt is separated into a princess line seam as well. Simple enough. Again, I am not doing this in any sort of like being very particular, being very couture about it. This is kind of slap and dash because it's a dressing gown. Like, it's fine. So I'm going to do the same thing for the back. I need to take the seam allowance off the back of the skirt. But again, I'm just taping on that center back piece and then like drawing a line down the middle of my A-line skirt, like so, to separate this into princess back piece. I am going to leave the full 45 length at the center back of this. So I'm kind of rounding that into the other side, just so I can have a tiny bit of extra length at the center back of this to trail behind me while I'm elegantly wafting around the house. Not so much. But again, I will separate the A-line skirt all the way up to the waist where that other piece is taped on, so that I can tape on the side back to the side, like so. But up here, again, I need to cut off the center back seam allowance on this because the skirt was designed to have a center back zipper, and it no longer will. It will now be cut on the fold. And again, I need to add seam allowance all down this princess line seam of the skirt that is now here. This is kind of like a gored skirt now, you know? Basically. You could do this to create a gored skirt. Just start cutting your A-line skirt into pieces. Sew them back together. As long as you add seam allowance, you can add as many gores as you want in there. Tear off this paper so I can just keep going. Adding seam allowance all the way along this seam. And up here again, it just kind of curves at the seam allowance. So there's not a fine, like, sharp point at the waist, but I just kind of gently curved it into the rest so there's a nice line down that princess seam. And finally, I will cut off that seam allowance from the center back, because again, this will be cut on the center back fold, this whole long piece now. So instead of having bodice pieces and skirt pieces, they're just dress pieces at this point. The waist seam has been eliminated. And the last piece, I'll be doing the same thing here. Again, side, back, and A-line skirt. Taping those together at the waist. Again, I end up with a little bit of extra that's kind of built in at the waist. That's all right. No worries. And again, I will just curve off this side a little more gently since it meets at such a sharp angle, which is like the angle that I prefer having on my dresses, which is why I like having a waist seam because I like that sharp defined waist, but not on a dressing gown, it's true. And again, adding seam allowance all the way along this skirt, using up all those scrap pieces. All right, so I'm going to trace the curve of my yoke here on a spare piece of paper. This is the back yoke that I'm doing first here. Well, actually I'm doing it second, but the first one I didn't get the recording of because sadly the camera cut out. I did this same process for the front as well. So I'm just kind of tracing the curve of the yoke, and then I'm going to draw on a semicircle, like extending the yoke, I suppose, to create the ruffle here. 8 inches, like so. So I'm going to add seam allowance up here along the yoke line because I'm going to need that to sew this to the yoke. This back can be cut on the fold, or at least it could if I had enough fabric, but I ended up cutting this with a seam back here. But I'm going to go ahead and split this every 2 inches. I'm kind of drawing a line out, radiating down along this ruffle. If I cut it just like this, then it would not ruffle. It would just be a circle shape, but I need to add extra fullness in here, basically like making it into a circle cut ruffle is what this is, really. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as that. I just think this is an easier way to do it. I'm going to cut up these lines and flare out my ruffle here. This would be very ruffly in a lighter weight fabric, but this is going to be 2 layers of this cotton flannel, so it still will have a bit of stiffness to it. So I'm adding in, again, not measuring at all. I'm just adding in about 3 or 4 inches triangles in between each of these. Grabbing spare paper. Each triangle is not the same. It doesn't really particularly matter. You can flare it, you know, more in areas for a particular look if you want. Like if you want it to be more ruffled in the back and quite flat over the shoulder, or vice versa, you can vary the size of the fullness that you're adding in here. But I'm just keeping it pretty consistent, like so. All right, so then I can cut all these pieces so that they're a nice smooth line again. I chose 8 inches wide, thinking I was going to lose ½ inch, by the way, because of course ½ inch along the outside here is going to be sacrificed as seam allowance, whereas at the top of this I added the seam allowance back on. And here I'm thinking, oh, well, I can't cut this on the center back now because it extends past where the fold would be, so I need to use a seam in the center back of this, which is good because, again, I didn't have enough fabric to cut this on the fold anyway, so no worries. Even with 14 yards of fabric, I didn't have a ton of left over. I probably have a ½ yard of each color left over after this, so I could have gotten away with 6½ yards of of each color. But again, a lot of fabric. But you can see how this ruffles once held up to the yoke, and I will tape down the floops on the back because they were already bothering me. You don't have to tape down your floops, but I do. But I did the same process to create the ruffle for the front. I just, again, didn't get footage of that. But here I am, cutting out all these long princess cut dress pieces. Sorry, this is kind of seasick-inducing footage here. From my lengths of flannel here. I, of course, had to cut those out in the main part of the basement on the large bit of floor. And whenever I crawl on the floor, I feel it the next day. I'm too old to do so. Either that or I just have 0 core strength as previously established. Both of those things can be true. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But I can start sewing together my ruffle pieces. So I have my 2 pieces for the ruffle for the back, 2 for the front. And so I just need to figure out, make sure I'm sewing these shoulder seams to the shoulder seams. This is kind of the shoulder seam of the back ruffle here. And then there's a center back seam as well. So go ahead and sew that center back first. And then I will sew the sides to the sides of the front pieces for both the gray and the burgundy here. This is sort of I think it's called a marble finish flannel is what this is. I will link to these fabrics below, but they look almost like velvet, which is why I quite like them. They're also very soft. When you first get this sort of fabric, the flannel fabric, sometimes it'll be quite smooth. Like it'll feel almost like a quilting cotton. And as soon as you wash it, it fluffs up a bit and gets a bit puffier and softer. So always pre-wash your cotton flannels. Plus then they won't shrink on you. Here I can start lining up my princess seams along the long lengths of this gown. So I'm lining up the back princess seams. The back side is sitting on top of the center back is what I'm trying to say here, but I couldn't find the words in my brain. So all the way along that long A-line skirt here. You don't actually need that many pins when doing this with flannel on flannel like this because the flannel sticks to itself quite well. It's like the soft side of Velcro almost. It like kind of sticks to itself and doesn't move that much. It doesn't even crawl that much, which is nice. But I'll set this next to the machine and I can start pinning the fronts together as well. Of course, I have to do all of this twice basically because I have this burgundy lining to do. So you'll be seeing mostly me constructing the gray portion of this, which is the outside, the fashion fabric, and then the red I will do magically off camera, like some sort of a cooking program where I'll be like Now attach your lining. Here's one I prepared earlier, you know, that kind of thing. Because you don't need to watch me pin 800 princess seams. That gets tiring, I know. But here I am pinning the front princess seam. So I'm pinning my side, well, I'm pinning my front onto my side front, because I like pinning, when I'm pinning princess seams, I like having the curvier piece underneath and the straighter piece on the top when I'm pinning these things. It just helps me stretch things into the right place. And of course, on a regular princess seam sort of garment, you're going to have a lot of notches to match up and stuff up in the bodice. And here I have none, because again, I'm working with this flannel, which is actually kind of a loosely woven fabric. So it's a bit not stretchy because there's anything spandex in it or like any bit of it is knit. It's just there's a lot of space in between the threads. So like if something's a little bit out of whack, it's fine. The fabric will absorb that kind of distance. Hopefully that makes sense to those of you who worked with loosely woven fabrics and stiffly woven fabrics. But also just because, again, it's a dressing gown. So I'm not being as precise with this, just because it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And again, even this princess seam gets covered by the long flounce. So if it wasn't perfect, it would be fine. But it came out actually quite nice. I say all of this as if, you know, it turns out kind of sloppy, and it doesn't. I guess I just know after years of sewing what I can get away with. That's a lot of that is experience talking, I think, actually. It sounds like laziness, but I think it's half laziness, half experience, and knowing what I can get away with when it comes to working with different fabrics and different style lines even. So, yeah. I mean, as usual, you know, put notches in, do as I say, not as I do. Over here on the machine, I can start sewing those things together. So here I am sewing the lining of the little cape portion, and also the same for the outside, like so. Half-inch seam allowance over here on the Singer 99K with some gray thread loaded in here. I actually started running out of black thread this last week. I was like, oh no. I try and always buy, whenever I place an order for fabric or anything, I try and always get a spool of black thread and a black dress length zipper, because those are the things I go through the fastest. And for some reason I was running out of black thread. I almost ran out. I was working on a different project and I was getting really close to the edge. I had to wind another bobbin. I was like, oh no, we don't have time for this. And luckily I had packed a little sewing kit when I went on my trip last fall. And I was like, where's that sewing kit? Because I bet you there's a spool of black thread in it. And that was like my last emergency black thread. And I found it upstairs and I was like, yes, I have a whole spool. Which saw me through before I got another couple spools in the mail. Thank goodness. Always need black thread. Always need black zippers. I sew with a lot of black things, you know? And I wouldn't have minded sewing this with black thread on a dark gray project, but because I was running low, I was like, dark gray thread it is. But again, I'm just sewing my long princess seams here, carefully through the machine, trying not to sew over any of these thicker pins, but occasionally one does escape underneath there. But sewing over my curved princess seam areas here, just sewing everything together. I just have all these long seams around the main body of the garment now to stitch together. So I will go ahead and do that, and we'll get this thing going. So I can go ahead and line up my shoulder seams now that the center back of this is sewn. So again, just lining up this large circle ruffle thing. I am going to sew this completely separately. I'm going to finish both sides of the whole ruffle. I'm going to finish the whole dressing gown and then stitch this onto the dressing gown last, just because I was like, I wanted to see what the dressing gown looked like without this ruffle, A, and B, in the future, it's possible that I may want to take it off or wash it separately, or who knows. So I just decided that's how I wanted to construct this. You could construct this dressing gown by sticking this ruffle in between the main body of the dress and the yoke before you sew the yokes on, but I just decided to do it all separately and finish this almost as two separate garments, like this little cape ruffle and then the dressing gown itself, and stitched it on separately. So you'll see what I mean later on. But I can go ahead and start trimming my long princess seams as well. So again, anytime you have a curve, you need to, well, unless it's a very shallow curve. Later in the hem, I won't clip this hem because it's very shallow. But anytime you have a more acute curve like this over the bust, you need to put clips in so that it will lay flatly. And so I'm clipping my curves, and then I will use my tailor's ham here to help press open the seam over the bust here along this princess seam, like so. And I'm not worried about this fraying or anything like that because it'll be fully lined, so it's not going to receive a ton of friction. So no worries there, but you can see the little pocket the princess seam creates for the bust there. But now that I have that front seam sewn, I can go ahead and stitch the yoke on. So I can go ahead and pin this onto the yoke. I, again, am surprised that, again, this shows just how malleable and loosely woven this flannel is, that this still matches even though, as we know, I left an extra bit on the dressing gown that I should have cut off. But clearly, sometimes mistakes can get made and things still work out, and sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes you think you do everything right, and yet it still doesn't work out. So, you know, sewing, there is a little bit of magic in it. I'm sorry. That's just the facts. But again, I can pin on the other yoke piece once I have that pressed. Always make sure you press your seams as you go, so everything is nice and smooth in the end. Because you want things to look nice and finished, of course. Over here on the machine, I can start sewing that last round of pinning. So I'm sewing my shoulder seams of the cape lining here. We'll just call it a cape ruffle thing. You know what I mean. We've got some Crimson Peak / Valentine's Day red lighting this time. Red lighting. It can either mean a horror movie or romance. It's either passion or violence, or sometimes both, you know? So we have red lighting here today on the singer. Although Crimson Peak would be a very strange film to watch for Valentine's Day. It is one of the more horror-ish films that I've ever seen. I don't watch horror films. I am a scaredy cat. I don't like disturbing visuals. So, you know, my friend once made me watch Shutter Island, and she was like, oh, it's like a psychological thriller, not a horror movie. But then there was some very nasty, well, not nasty, but like haunting visuals. And I was like, I am an insomniac. I already have trouble falling asleep. I just don't need this, you know? So that's my opinion. I don't mind scary things or violent things, like in fiction in general. I guess that doesn't bother me. But like, just really particularly visuals, I'm like, no, thank you. Which in Crimson Peak, of course, mostly the visuals are absolutely decadently, deliciously Victorian goth, except for there are some very scary ghosts in that film. And I've gotten a little bit better because of like the exposure therapy, researching this film while working on 1890s stuff, at looking at these ghosts, but they are very creepy ghosts. Exceptionally creepy ghosts. So, good on Guillermo. Guy knows what he's doing when it comes to creating creepy stuff. But, man, the rest of that film, aesthetically, I mean, the ghosts are also aesthetically great, in that they are very creepy. And I think it's very easy to do that kind of thing and have it look cheesy. So, they've succeeded in not doing that, but it is honestly too creepy for me. Ooh. If there are any other, like, gothic films that are not disturbing visually, but, like, pretty visually, let me know. And I will see if I can handle them. Once again, I can press that round of sewing over here on the ironing board. Like so. Speaking of spooky things, you can see I still have some Halloween-ish decorations out here. A couple of gifts that I received. Thank you very much. I have a pincushion and a little lantern here. We all know how I love a lantern. No matter the size. Small lanterns, giant lanterns. I'm all about it. I love a lantern. My like goal in life is to have some sort of like a back porch or patio or garden area, nook of a garden, where I can have like tables and chairs to sit outside and have tons of lanterns hanging everywhere. I just think that would be very fun. Not that I have a green thumb, because my garden will be hard to maintain because I am very bad at keeping plants alive, sadly. But lanterns, I can keep alive no problem. But I'm going to go ahead and fully line this little cape. So right sides together, I'm pinning all the way along the outside of the circle ruffle here. I'm pinning the ends closed, I'm pinning the inside closed. I'm going to turn this whole thing inside and right side out. And just basically bag line the whole thing. And then press it nicely. And again, this stuff holds its, like when you press this right side out, it holds against itself really well because again, it's fuzzy. So it's got a kind of Velcro effect where it sticks to itself. My yoke seams here along the front are curved, so I need to clip them. So I'm clipping that here, and then I can press those open flat and nice and smooth. Luckily again, because this is 100% cotton, it does press very nicely as well. Give that thing a little bit of steam and it's never going anywhere again. Kind of just sticks down. So here's my yoke seam there. Same for this other front piece. And once I have my backs constructed, or my back constructed with against the back yoke as well, I can sew my side seams of this. Sewing the whole main body of the dress itself, basically. I, of course, have no Valentine's Day plans. Being ace, I never have had any Valentine's Day plans. Actually, I think in, like, 8th grade, I had a Valentine. Like, me and, like, some dude agreed to exchange gifts. And I think I, like, got him, like, some Snickers or something. like a bag of Snickers, which who doesn't want a bag of Snickers, to be honest? And I think he forgot to get me something. I don't recall much. But, you know, it was one of those things where as a child, everyone had crushes. Or not as a child, as a preteen, everyone like had a crush. And I was like, I guess I should choose someone, quote unquote, to be my crush because like otherwise I'm going to be weird here. And so I was like, this guy, he's so cute, you know? And basically was just confused because I didn't really understand what crushes were. And now I know it's because I don't experience them, which makes much more sense. I thought you just chose a person who was like not, that like you didn't find disgusting. Like you're like, oh, this person's aesthetically fine to look at. They don't seem particularly rude. I didn't realize that was like actually like a physical, like, oh my god, nervous kind of thing around a person. Thought y'all were making it up. One day, maybe I'll experience attraction. It hasn't happened yet. I mean, in the abstract. We've all seen Kate Beckinsale, you know? But I think that's a little bit different, that kind of attraction. But I'm just going to sew my back yoke onto my backs the same way that I was doing the fronts. Only, of course, all in one piece like this because this garment opens in the front. No closures on this other than some, like, ties later. So no zippers or buttons or anything like that to worry about, which is always nice. I don't know. I just feel like you have to make something and then you're finished and then, except for I still have to do all these buttonholes and buttons. Or, like, I have to sew on 8,000 hooks and eyes. But with this, no. It's just done. You sew on some ribbons to tie the thing in the front shut and you're good to go. For some reason that makes me feel like it's faster. I've never actually timed it to know. But now I have to go ahead and again bag line this whole ruffle thing. It'll take me a while. Let's, you know, skip ahead, honestly. I'm just going to be sewing all the way around this round thing forever. And over here I can again clip my curve back yoke seam here. Like so. My scissors are not very sharp. All of my scissors need to be sharpened because the place I used to take them to get sharpened here in Denver no longer exists. So for several years I've just suffered, honestly. With these oil slick, like rainbow scissors, at least I just bought a new pair because I was like, well, I can't get my scissors sharpened right now. I'm just going to buy another pair of scissors, honestly. So I can have more than one here in the studio. I mean, I do sew like as my job, so I try not to feel bad about buying equipment. Although we all know I don't feel bad enough about buying anything, do I? Facts. Once again, this ruffle thing, cape thing, is very curvy. So I'm going to put clips in this inside curve edge as much as I can, again with my stupid dull scissors. And then I need to clip triangles outside of the outside curve. So concave curve, slits, convex curve, triangles. Hopefully that makes sense. It's some geometry going on here, but I can cut little triangles out of the edge of this and you end up with some fabric confetti. Once again, people tell me that they save these things, like these tiny bits, to like stuff stuff, and I'm always just like, stuff what? I wonder. I don't make many plushies or things that need to be stuffed, I suppose, so I don't usually save tiny scraps. It's true. Alright, so let's turn this all right side out. I left one end of this open, and I of course clipped my corners as well as my curves here so that everything can be pressed smoothly and nicely. And again, this holds the pressing quite well because the flannel is so sticky. And again, at last, with my princess seams sewn, I can sew the side seams of the main body of the garment as well. So those are sewn together, again, clipped on the curves and pressed open, and then I can pin my shoulder seams together. Do that now here, fronts to backs, and I can stitch that, and then I do need to start sewing my sleeves together, so I will sew the underarm, or like the seam of my sleeves here. Set those next to the machine, do that for both the gray and the burgundy, because I will be fully lining these sleeves. I'm not putting anything in these to create extra puff up at the top. Once again, it's going to be covered by the floopy cape thing anyway, so I'm just relying on the 2 layers of flannel to be enough puff up there, honestly. But over here on the machine, again, I'll just sew all that stuff with 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual over here. And I will clip these curved underarm seams on these sleeves as well, because again, I'm not worried about them fraying, since it's fully lined once again. And nice and cozy for wearing down here in the basement, where it has been quite chilly. And in fact, you know, I always say, like, it's troublesome down here because I have the heater sounds and I have the air conditioner sound in the summertime, so it's not the best place for recording audio in general. But I also have the problem of like my iron and space heater not being able to be plugged in at the same time because the electrics aren't designed for that kind of nonsense. But also I can't record voiceovers like this without turning the space heater off because it's too loud as well. So it is a chillier time down here. This is why I need cozy flannel dressing gowns. But with all that sewn, I can again clip my curves and press that open as previously established. And then I'm just going to like leave the bottom, I don't know, 5 inches of these closer to the underarm flat, and then put gathering stitching along the rest of the sleeve cap, this big giant sleeve cap, so I can gather these down and fit them into the arm size of my fashion fabric and lining before I bag line the whole entire dressing gown. But here I'm going to set my sleeves in. So again, I just have some 2 lines of gathering stitching, just basting length stitches up here along the entire giant sleeve cap here. I'm going to gather this all down and set this into my garment. No problemo. It's much easier to do this than it is to do the sleeves on the actual Mandragora gown, which are kind of a hassle to do those giant sleeves in taffeta, especially because I don't have to worry about this fraying on me the whole time, whereas when I'm working with silk taffeta, I'm like, please don't come apart. You're so pretty. Whereas the flannel is super easy to work with, comparatively. But I'll just go ahead and pin this in here, all around the arm side, distributing my gathers. But I will go ahead and set this sleeve in here over on the machine. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance as usual. Just setting these buddies in here. And I ran into no problems from having lowered the arm again, by the way, because I did lower this arm side to give myself a little bit more room for wearing this over t-shirts and stuff. But it created no problems for me. But now I have the main body of the thing and I have the lining of the thing. I need to match them up right sides together and bag line all around the like 2 front openings and the bottom hem of this. I'm going to leave the neckline completely open. I will finish that with a standing collar in a minute here. But I just need to align both of these things up. This again, at this point, is around 12 yards of fabric that I'm flooping around in here. So it is kind of heavy and irritating at this point, but that's right. It's worth it in the end, especially over here on the machine, where I should have done that trick that a couple of you quilters have told me about, where you put an extra little card table next to the machine, like on the other end, to hold the giant project while you're working on it. But instead I was just trying to balance it on the table, or in my arms, honestly. It's arm day over here. And I will need to clip my corners. I'm not going to clip the curved hem of this A-line skirt just because it's so like obtuse or like wide of a curve that it's not going to create any problems for me, especially with this loosely woven fabric. But I will clip my corners so that those can be nice and sharp. And then I will turn this all right side out through the neckline now that it is all bag lined together. And then I do need to draft that collar pattern because, like I said, I had forgotten to do so. So over here, I'm going to use the instructions from that same pattern drafting book that I used to draft all my standing collars. So I'm just teeing off a line here. And then from the center back here, I need to measure the center back length of my back pattern here, like so. That's 3 inches. Do the same for the front pattern. This is about 4 1/4. So I'll go 4 1/4 to the center front, that is. So this collar is probably not going to meet exactly in the front. I could make it extend out further if I wanted to fully overlap like the dressing gown will, but instead I'm just going to have it end near the center front. Because again, I don't want this to be too tight of a collar or too tall of a collar. I'm not going to use any interfacing on this collar because I don't want it to be too stiff. This is a dressing gown. It's not supposed to be formal wear. I want it to be comfortable most of all. So I'm only going to make this 1.5 inches tall. Also, the collar on the Crimson Peak coat is a little bit... the collar is taller. Yeah, that's right. The collar on the Crimson Peak coat is a bit taller. Blah, 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 blah. Could use another cup of coffee, not gonna lie. And then this collar just gets tipped up a 1/2 inch in the front, and it's really easy to draft standing collars. I've done it before here on the channel. I did it in my shirt video, so I'll link to that where I probably take more time to describe what the heck is going on. But this sort of thing is actually quite simple, and I'm just gonna find a scrap that's big enough that I can cut this out of both the burgundy and of the gray. I will, of course, have the burgundy on the inside lining here, and the gray on the outside to match the rest of the coat, or dressing gown rather. So I'll just layer those up, stitch around the top edge of this so I can have my little collar ready to go and use to finish the top edge of my now fully lined dressing gown. But I will sew that over here on the machine, and I will also sew some strips together using the rest of my burgundy fabric. I just tore strips that were 5 inches wide in the width of the fabric, which I think was only 45 with this. I just tore 4 strips that were 5 inches wide and 40 at least inches long, and I'm just going to sew those into tubes to use as the ribbon ties in the front for the belt and the neck on this garment. So I'm just going to sew those together here as well while I'm over here. I had run out of thread, so I had to reload my bobbin and keep going. Constantly having to reload the bobbin here, and I do create little pointed ends on these, like so, just so it looks a little bit more like ribbon. So I can go ahead and clip my curves and corners over here above the ironing board. Press this collar all nicely. Again, I didn't interface this. I didn't want it to be stiff at all. I wanted it to be quite soft, honestly. I know I keep saying this, but it's just a house coat, you know. Again, not formal wear. So I'm going to use this to sandwich my neckline here. I'm just finding the center of this. So I'm going to sew just the gray layer down, right sides together, all along the top neckline edge of my dressing gown here. And then I will fold the burgundy layer in on the inside separately to finish this all off and stitch it down by hand. So that is the plan here. Like so, I have about an inch of extra overlap at either end. The collar doesn't extend all the way to the end of the coat because it just goes to the center front and the coat goes past it. So hopefully that makes sense. I keep saying coat, house coat, abbreviated. We'll go ahead and stitch that on. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance, as always, over here on the machine. Then I will need to clip this just because the neckline is a curved edge. So I'll clip this, fold everything up inside the collar, and then encase it in the red side of this. I did end up just felling that down inside there with some red thread that matched as neatly as I could. And then I'm going to go ahead and hem these edges of the sleeves as well. Again, these sleeves are very long, so this is going to be cuffed a couple of times, and so I don't have to worry about this being hyper pretty. So I ended up, instead of slip stitching this together by hand, I just did a very narrow, like I came in about 1/8 of an inch and just sewed this on the machine. So there's visible stitching on my sleeve cuffs, but again, they're cuffed twice. You would never see it. Then for my little strips that I made earlier, I'm just going to sew those on up here by the, underneath the collar at the neckline, and then I will sew another set down lower, and then I can finally sew my ruffle cape collar thing on here as well. But I'll do that last. I'll sew these ribbons on first, then I sewed these ones further down here at my waist. Just sewed those to where the princess seam is, and you'll see how that looks in the end. And I can tie that top one in a bow, but then all I have left to do is attach my cape onto here. So this doesn't come all the way again to the full overlap, so I just have this like so that I can have a little bit of extra room around here. And I'm going to pin this along the yoke seam, and then I'm going to fell this, like fell/backstitch this down as invisibly as I can along here, just securing that along the yoke seam. Again, you can sew this in, sandwiched in the yoke seam if you would like, but I wanted it to be kind of removable, so I did not. So here is that waist tie that helps tie this closed. Kind of gets hidden by the other tie, which is good because it just makes the ribbons of my neck ribbon look longer. And then I have my funny flouncy cape with its red lining here, peeking out in the folds. But I think this came out quite similar to the inspiration from Crimson Peak. I really like this. I think, again, if you made it in the Crimson Peak colors, you could make it in that like light gray with the colorful ribbons like she has. You could do even embroidery work or a soutache kind of work like the actual coat has. But this is fully lined in the red here, very fun, and makes me feel like I'm ready to solve some mysteries or poison somebody, brew a potion, just how I like. Do I feel a little bit like Lady Tremaine, the evil stepmom from Cinderella, in this ensemble? Yes, but you know, I do try and go for a villainous situation most of the time. I'm just usually more leaning onto the more Maleficent vibes, and like this with a green, like a lime green and purple, would be fun sometime in the future. Perhaps could just make these in every color. Honestly, they're not that hard to make. It just takes a crap ton of fabric. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this rather ridiculous house coat came together today. I feel also like Sherlock Holmes with this really weird cape thing. You could easily make this into a very Sherlock Holmesian or like just 1890s inspired coat just by making it out of wool instead of out of cotton flannel like I've done here. Then it would be a little bit less washable. You're going to dry clean only at that point, but even this would be a pain to wash because it's just so much fabric. Thank you as always for watching this video today, and make sure to check out the other videos that I've linked down in the description below. I'll be back here with more sewing, costuming, crafting occasionally, and vintage fashion of course real soon, and I'll see you then. Bye.